Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about NAT. NAT stands for Network Address Translation. Before we talk about NAT, we need to talk about history. In the 1980s, they created IPv4, which is a 32-bit long address. Since it's 32 bits long, it had just over 4 billion potential public addresses. During that time, they thought they would be enough. They were wrong. Today we have many devices. Many households have multiple devices, such as printers, smartphones, tablets, laptops, computers, and Internet of Things. Hey Alexa, subscribe to Tech Dork. All these devices need an IP address. Therefore, we started to run out of IP addresses. One of the solutions to this problem was to create private IP addresses. They created 3 groups of private IP addresses: Class A, Class B, and Class C. The issue with private IP addresses was that they could not access the internet. Only public IP addresses can. So what NAT does is it turns private addresses to public addresses. Here's an example of NAT. Say you have 3 machines in your house: a computer, a laptop, and a smartphone. All these devices have a private IP address, but they want to reach internet. What would happen is, if they try to reach the internet, the router would take these private IP addresses and translate it to a public IP address, which then allows the devices to access the internet. There are 3 different types of NAT. The first one is PAT, which stands for Port Address Translation. PAT is commonly used in your home. It allows all your devices to translate to one single public IP address. For example, if you had 3 PCs in your house, PC1, PC2, and PC3, they all wanted access to the internet. Well, they all would have to share one public IP address because your home router will be assigned one public IP address. If PC1 needed to access the internet, the router would translate its private IP to a public IP. If PC2 needed to access the internet, the router would translate its private IP to a public IP. The same goes with PC3. Now, the other type of NAT is SNAT, which stands for Static Network Address Translation. With SNAT, you will manually assign private IP addresses to public IP addresses. For example, if you have 3 servers in your environment: Server 1, Server 2, and Server 3. Each of these servers has a private IP address. You will assign each server manually to translate to a public IP address. The next type of NAT is DNAT, which stands for Dynamic Network Address Translation. In DNAT, all the devices on the network will be translated to a public IP address within a public IP pool. For example, say you had 3 PCs in your network. If PC1 needed to access the internet, the router will look at its private IP address and then swap it with a public IP address. And it'll get this public IP address from its pool. If PC2 needed to access the internet, the router will take its IP address and swap it with a public IP address from its pool. The same story with PC3. You might be wondering how the router remembers all these IP addresses. Well, the router saves everything in what's called a NAT table. And the NAT table keeps record of which IP belongs to which IP. Therefore, there is a drawback to DNAT, because it's expensive to have multiple public IP addresses, and it's load expensive on routers to remember each IP addresses. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe and like.